Well, what do you guys think of? I mean, she doesn't, I don't think she appears in any substantive way in terms of like having any lines or whatever, but Antony's wife, yeah, Fulvia. So, in like historically, like in some respects, she's just kind of similar to Cleopatra in the sense
Mhm.
that, here's a woman that sort of like, takes control in a somewhat unconventional way.
Yeah.
Conventional in terms of Egypt, and Fulvia's role in Rome was considered very out of the ordinary because when Antony was not in Rome, she was essentially doing a lot of the kind of machinations behind the scenes. She engineered or helped participate in any number of civil wars or getting people on Antony's side. Right, there was this whole big thing with a land acquisition where Octavius's conflict with Antony was predicated partly on, okay, so what are we going to do now? Are we going to either give some land up to these soldiers that are craving it, which means we have to like actually confiscate it from Roman towns, like literally, like what ended up happening was like physical expulsions, or do we simply ignore that and keep the Senate on our side, right? Because the Senate does not really want to participate too much in rocking the boat too much there.
Well, the
And
Senate are also the landlords too. So
yeah, yeah,
if
exactly.
land's getting confiscated, it's probably theirs.
Yeah, and Octavius ultimately decides, okay, we're going to actually confiscate the land because as bad as, getting on the wrong side of the Senate might be, the fact is right now, I need soldiers, I need men, and I need them to be happy. And Fulvia's sort of like behind the scenes trying to like as that's about to happen, she wants to make sure that it's like according to her timetable, like she wants to make sure that these confiscations and the land being doled out happens when Antony's also at the same time in Rome, so that Antony and Octavius can both take the credit for doing something that ultimately will be perceived as a popular thing to do. So she's very critical to this, and if you like read her biography, she's a very interesting fellow. But at the same time, she doesn't really play a substantial role in the play, like in terms of having lines. But like early on, when there's like the news of Fulvia's death and Antony, this is in Act One, Scene Two. Right, so she dies pretty early. This is how he characterizes it. This is on around like line 135. There's a great spirit gone, thus did I desire it. What our contempts doth often hurl from us, we wish it ours again. The present pleasure, by revolution lowering, thus become the opposite of itself. She's good being gone, the hand that could pluck her back that shoved her on. I must from this enchanting queen break off. 10,000 harms more than the ills I know my idleness doth hatch. I find that an interesting speech, partly because, first of all, the death is immediately, set side by side with like, I need to escape, right? I need to escape this other woman, Cleopatra. Maybe he has this idea in his head that, I could have mistreated Fulvia in various ways because Antony was like very well known as a womanizer, that kind of thing. But at the same time, she did for me the kinds of things that Cleopatra might be doing, but instead of maybe leading me to ruin like Cleopatra might, Fulvia was always looking out for my best interest. So, what do you think about her presence, like as a, as a kind of like a ghost in the play? Because a lot of attention obviously is played on the presentation of Cleopatra, who she is, how she gets interpreted as being, very salacious and, this kind of like black hole of like sucking all the energy out and destroying great men and whatnot. But at the same time, like there's also like a feminist reading, or if you want to go there, for someone like Fulvia, that I think it's really kind of like underreported in the critical analyses that I saw of the play. So anybody wants to take away from that?
Yeah, to be
Oh, go
honest,
ahead,
like even
Laura.
without, I find it interesting, like just like hearing the historical context there, because like even without knowing that, I kind of like thought it was interesting where you see at first like he's kind of complaining about, oh, Fulvia's like doing all these things on my behalf, and it's Caesar is getting kind of starting to get annoyed, blah blah blah, sending him all the message. But it was like quite interesting that like there is the sort of commonality with Cleopatra there in terms of being like he's associated with these two women that are both have like as like their own amount of political power and their own kind of agendas in this way. And then there's a kind of a contrast when you have later when he there's the marriage like kind of contract broached between Marc Antony and Caesar's sister Octavia, who is like, you know, despite being actually in the play and having lines, is probably less of a presence than we get from like Fulvia in the brief time she's mentioned, because she's just there to be like, oh, she's the perfect like paragon of Roman womanhood and like is virtuous and proper. And Caesar loves her and is angry when Marc Antony fucks her over. But like that's it. She's just there, you know? And like she's there to be kind of placed as this, oh, she's no Cleopatra. So like there is, I don't know about a feminist reading, but there is something like interesting being kind of like upheld there in terms of the way the play like depicts its women.
Yeah,
Like in the sense that like she's just like, you know, at least there's something interesting or compelling enough about like the mentions of Fulvia that like there is like, you know, it is sticks in your head despite her never actually appearing.
yeah, I don't know if it's really I mean, when you're talking about a play from like 1607, anytime you get into like, oh, here's my feminist reading of it, you know, you're potentially asking for trouble, you know, because
Yeah.
these concepts
Yeah,
really,
we are asking for trouble.
yeah,
indeed.
that's not how that, and I just mean like even like in terms of intellectual coherence, because this really is like you can't, I mean, it's a lens that was developed afterwards, obviously, but also like the way that women were viewed in antiquity was like more complex than just like, oh, they were pure objects of exchange or whatever, you know, like women could be politically very influential even if they couldn't necessarily occupy the big office, you know, like they could be the one that was actually doing most of the machinations, but they needed to have a man as the brand of their work or whatever, because they couldn't be the face of the brand. I mean, that's the interesting thing about like great men historically is they're not just and this is true of presidents nowadays too. It's not just the guy and the decisions they make. It's like the whole system of advisors and confidants and patronage networks and things like that underlie them. And while women couldn't be like the face of that very often, they could absolutely be the ones that were like making most of the decisions, especially if the guy was, you know, more feckless or less ambitious or driven or whatever.
Yeah,
But what I
sorry,
sort
go
of
on.
get from Fulvia in this context is, you know, she's a paragon of Romanness in that despite having been pushed to the side by her husband, she still has her eye on the ball. You know, she is going to war with Antony's brother, but then they decide to find a rapprochement and they decide to turn their weapons on Caesar for one reason or another. You know, so and if Antony were more of a paragon of Romanness, you would be able to appreciate that, but he's too caught up in this like Orientalist web of decadence and luxury or whatever, which we never see, but it is purported to have happened. You know, so that's kind of the place that it serves. But it is interesting that we don't get the melodrama of her coming up and confronting him like, how dare you, you know, what you've done to me. Well, so on the one hand, it would maybe be nice to hear from her because she sounds like an interesting character, but in some ways she's more like it sticks in your brain more, like in terms of we're talking about Antony as like a somewhat pathetic and even, you know, quipped kind of figure, perhaps. You know, the fact that he can so easily let go of someone like that and get caught up in this, you know, in these pleasures of the flesh or whatever. I mean, it does tell you a lot about him, and she sticks more in the mind as somebody that's only alluded to and that you don't really get independent access to.
I think as well as that, just to like, this is like a little bit of a tangent, but regarding like the whole like issue of like feminist lens or whatever, like I'm generally kind of against that. But I think like this kind of, I think one of the problems is you can very much like, I think this is a play where there's like interesting things to talk about regarding, you know, like it's like women and men and like, you know, sexual relationships and the masculine versus the feminine. But like, I just think, look, you don't have to look at it through a feminist lens or refer to it in this way to kind of like discuss like, or to look at a lot of the ways that's done, because it's very much, I think like it plays into the whole it's kind of a more broader thing. Like it very much plays into the whole exotifying of Egypt. Like nearly there's a sort of like many times throughout the Roman characters will refer to Egypt and these like as being the something kind of effeminate and like and all these kind of terms. They'll refer to it like associate with Cleopatra and these feminine wiles and this kind of existence, and they'll kind of refer to Marc Antony as being somehow like effeminized during his time there in comparison to the this martial Roman kind of like, masculine kind of role, which is like, I do think there's like something interesting there to look at without necessarily having to like do, like you say, like a kind of intellectually incoherent, like feminist reading of it. Like there's more there. And I think like even like just regarding, you have like a lot of times, so even in just that quote where you refer, like you have Antony referring to the news of Fulvia, he says like, I must from this enchanting queen break off, like continually you see throughout it. And this kind of like escalates in Act 4 before his death, where he just refuses to take responsibility for his own actions in a way. Like, I think there's an interesting thing going on where he like continually like, well, and the other characters, Caesar also does, and, Barbas does this as well. And like, refers to Cleopatra as, kind of having him whipped, being this manipulator behind the scenes, but she is manipulative, but he's very much making his own decisions, and you get the sense he's very happy to be manipulated. Like he very much could leave. It's very easy for him to go like, oh, she's kind of forcing my hand to stay here. I couldn't do anything else. It's like it's just like somebody who's utterly refusing to take any responsibility for his own destiny. And it is kind of like maybe a little subversive in that way, like Keith said, like of the whole tragic hero thing, because, there can be the sense of in a lot of Shakespeare's plays of like, there being star-crossed or being destined, but like you outright see here, he's just making all the wrong choices continuously and refusing to do anything different. Yeah. So yeah. Well, and I mean, as you can tell, like I'm not a fan of that in a person, but I think it's a very, very interesting dramatic choice. And I think it's probably why the play kind of does resonate, because it does explore, or it does like represent that type of person, that type of character in a way that's still quite recognizable,
Yeah, well, but it's also probably why it's performed less, because it's not exactly, if you're plunking down $50 to go see Shakespeare in a theater or whatever, it's not necessarily what you expect out of Shakespeare. You don't get that the grandiosity and virtuousness of the character and the beautiful speeches and whatnot. You don't get a lot of that stuff. It's a lot more. The depictions of a lot of the characters is a lot more granular, and you have to kind of follow it in order to really see what he's doing. And I mean, that's from a literary perspective very valuable, but from like a theatrical financial perspective, I could sort of see why that would maybe be, this would be last in the rotation, like, okay, we have to do this one because we've done every other one of the plays in the last few years or whatever. But, in terms of like, it's a hard issue to talk about, because the fact of feminism as an extant discourse means that we can talk about a character like Cleopatra in a more interesting way than like a Victorian scholar of Shakespeare, who probably would read it purely in terms of Eastern feminine decadence, corrupting this great man, or
even someone like T.S. Eliot, like was one I read.
Well, Victorian in spirit, that one, perhaps, but with like the fact of feminism means that, because Cleopatra is an interesting character in this play, you really, the thing that's fascinating about the play is that you really never quite get a sense of her, because does she even really love Marc Antony?
Yeah,
it's like hard to tell
exactly. There's a lot of ambiguities there.
There really is an ambivalence and an ambiguity to her character that, because feminism has been a thing and a discourse that has been in academia, you can talk about that. But, at the same time, there is this, when you're doing these like various ismic analyses of a writer like Shakespeare, whether it's post-colonial or feminist or this or that, it becomes like, oh, here's why Shakespeare was actually doing what we would want him to do, all along. Like he was like, Shakespeare was secretly woke. And that's really not the analysis. Like, that's not a fruitful way of reading a 500-year-old or a 400-year-old writer, both in terms of like even just enjoying it for what it is, you're really getting far away from something that could be like I mean, art should enrich your life, you know, it's not just an object of intellectual abstract contemplation. It's also like it's that fusion of like the intellect and the spiritual, you know, it's something that
But like,
you should be able to draw
fundamentally, I
some
just think
enrichment
that
from.
it's somewhat of a trend as well. And like, again, this is getting a little off topic, but I do think it's like relevant to maybe why something like this isn't. It's just like, like there is, there probably has always been to some degree, but like there is very much consciously people who like just want art to present a mirror. Like, and you see this a lot. I know, I'm sure you're familiar with like the absolutely questionable, like, you know, Twitter discourse around this, and it's like it tends to be like veiled under like this moralistic think of the children thing, but it's near like this like discourse over, oh, how should you represent a character drinking alcohol in your book? Is it okay to have them getting drunk? And like this kind of young adult like queer discourse, but like it's not just the young
adult writers and readers
overt example of that, because they have the pretext of like, oh, we'll think of the children. But I also see this seeping out in general to when I talk with adults about supposed literature, and it's like, you know, like you can't want to present a mirror to you. That's just boring. It's solipsistic. It's like, why are you reading Shakespeare? Like, why are you, you know, it's this, like, why would you, I wouldn't want everyone to think like me or to be like me. I read this stuff, like it's a communication. I want to see like, okay, how does he write this and represent these things in a way I would never consider to do?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's not even a mirror. It's like when Homer Simpson is looking in the mirror and he sees himself like all muscular and he's going like, dude, you know, like, you know, because they don't want a mirror. They want like an aspirational draw,
filtered like Snapchat
know?
filter or something where you look in
it. Yeah, they want
pretty...
a moral snap. They want art to be represented through like a moral Snapchat filter. That's a great way of putting it. You know, it's like, and I mean, you pretty much, if you want to appreciate art at all, I would say you pretty much have to, like, I guess you have to maintain a sort of peripheral awareness of modern discourse around it, but you mostly just have to unplug from it, because we're not the internet, we're in a real bad place with the internet, and we haven't figured it out as a species yet. So until we do, the nature of discourse is just going to continually degrade and drag things down to I mean, for lack of a better term, the lowest common denominator of like who is the most bothered by it, who can make the most inflammatory remarks about something, and you know, who the squeaky wheel gets the grease, as the cliche goes. And that's, you can't let yourself as someone who's interested in or producing art get dragged into that, because it's just gonna it's a dead end, and it's like your consciousness of it and trying to play to it is just going to make whatever it is that you're doing or thinking worse. You know, it is. I mean, you have to maintain peripheral awareness, because there might be something that gets brought up that, you know, is actually interesting or worth reckoning with or whatever. But for the most part, it's just a posturing pissing contest. And there's young adult writers especially, but a lot of the readers too. They're just like, that's the most like psychotic and like fucked up space that I think I've ever seen.
If you check out like young adult Twitter or whatnot, you know, it's literally just full of adults kind of, you know, just jockeying for status and virtue signaling about who cares about children the most. I care about kids more than you do, because look at your fucking book and what you wrote. I would never, display this in front of children. I would never, put these racist ideas. And it's, we're not even talking about racist ideas. We're talking about whether or not, Mark Twain should be taught. But to get back to Fulvia for a second, so like Keith mentioned the idea of like, token women being essentially just kind of like, used as a means to an end. And with Fulvia specifically, like both in the universe and the play, as well as, the real life Fulvia, her death is used as an occasion to, for Antony and Octavius to make up, right? In the play later on, like the death is like, all right, so we're going to essentially pin all these civil wars and whatnot upon her, right? And we could sort of, just push her to the wayside. Which it's interesting also from a psychological standpoint. So to get back to the the quote that I read when he says about her death, "Thus did I desire it. What our contempts doth often hurl from us, we wish it ours again." So it's not as if he's like unaware of what's going through his own head, it's not as if he's unaware of the fact that, he keeps trying to find, like ever escalating means of acquiring pleasure, right? New people, new variety, right? That whole famous thing about, Cleopatra like presenting like varieties of, womanhood and
basically that like
experience.
she never gets old, but like
Yeah,
in a sense.
yeah,
I
exactly.
think like there's definitely it's like both, like, to be honest, both Antony and Cleopatra just strike as very like narcissistic people, to put it
Hmm.
in a modern sense. Like, and there's something there about the way it's like it just does make it quite compelling to read as theater, because like I don't know, like I've met people who live their lives in that sense, where they have this like sense, often I'm skewed, of being watched and how people will react to them, and oftentimes it's a very skewed sense and they don't have an accurate idea of how people are viewing them, but it's this constant consciousness. And I feel like, this is maybe, it's not, written with maybe the level of psychological depth that you'd get in like, the 20th century onwards in term, or 19th century onwards, even in terms of plays. But like you could, it does kind of hit on some kind of aspect of that kind of person or that kind of psyche or whatever, that it does kind of make it quite interesting, like in the reasons you mentioned, like where there's this sense he's very conscious of how it's viewed, but like he's quite conscious of his own foibles, but like the show must go on, like, and he just kind of continues on with it. And then you have like just the next page on after that quote, he's talking to Enobarbus and he tells him of Fulvia's death, and he gets back, sir, give the gods a thankful sacrifice. And then this whole spiel about how essentially, oh, when your wife dies, like it's giving you the chance to get something new and better. And to that, and in a very flippant kind of humorous way. And like, so it's like, this grief is crowned with consolation. Your old smock brings forth a new petticoat. And indeed, the tears live in an onion that should water this sorrow. So it's like in this very jovial kind of way. And that's about the most he gets. And it's sort of like, this pretty much gives him, he just moves on after that. It's like gives him permission to be like, okay, whatever.